Hey everybody, I'm almost caught up on grading and I'm here to discuss the June 19th and 20th discussions. The first thing I wanted to say off the bat was that the June 19th discussion question came packaged with a pretty dumb assumption, which I have gone back and changed the wording of on the Canvas model for the course. It said, assume that you are a child, blah, 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 blah. Now assume that you are an African-American child. Okay, so the first time when it said assume you're a child, it should have said assume you're a white child. Obviously, we don't want to make the assumption that these sort of that all children are white, or that the default assumption about a person should be that they're white, or that they should be the first perspective that's considered, and a normative perspective that's considered, and then, of course, the black children are, of course, an alternative perspective to be considered. So I changed that. Now, I want us to push back on the assumption that life was invariably material superior for everyone in 1930 than it was in 1920 or 1910. We need to look at what was real access to electricity, indoor plumbing, the automobile, everything, mass transportation like across those decades for different demographics of the American public. And obviously, as we talked about in this discussion and in this module, there's a racial disparity in access to those kinds of infrastructures and technologies. But there's also an urban-rural divide, much like there is today, in access to technology. As for the racial disparities in access, most of you latched onto the difficulty Black Americans had in accessing public transportation, namely streetcars in Philly, as per the Zylstra article, which is perfectly understandable. But I want us to think critically about their access to other infrastructural services. And to that end, I went and found this article, which I've linked to in this announcement, called Race, Space, and Electric Power, Jim Crow in the 1934 North Carolina Rural Electrification Survey. So the state of North Carolina went around and it surveyed its different populations in order to get a sense of their potential electrical usage, and so that it could plan out its electrification infrastructure, especially for rural communities. They're basically trying to get a sense of, okay, how much electricity do we think we're going to need to create a supply for? So they're trying to estimate demand. And starting out in 1930, only 3.2% of North Carolina farms had electricity. This is a time when, according to the Calvin Coolidge Foundation, who was president at the time, at the beginning of the 1920s, 30% of homes had electricity, and by the end of the decade, 70% of homes had electricity. Okay, well, among North Carolina farms, which is a sort of sample of the North Carolina rural population, only 3.2% of them had access to electricity. So we're talking about a wide disparity in people's access to electricity. And when it came to to their plan for how much electricity is supplied to build power plants for, they applied a 15 to 20% markdown for every Black household that they counted in this survey. Basically assumed that Black households would have less access to electrical appliances, and almost certainly for racist reasons, that Blacks would consume less electricity than whites, even when they had the same access to electrical appliances. This represents something of a modern technological rendition of the 3/5 rule, which numerically devalued Black personhood for the first 75 years of the United States. Basically discounting their access to electricity, making certain racially coded assumptions about the kind of access to the technology that they could have, and in so doing, reifying, making concrete their lack of access. You're literally building into the system a deficiency for Black people. So that's just to get us thinking, beyond streetcars and mass transportation, to think about other kinds of infrastructure that had racial disparities. And these kinds of disparities are just a relic of 100 years ago in rural North Carolina. They're still present today. A recent article that studied families' access to energy efficiency and government incentives found that non-Hispanic white households were more likely than indigenous, Hispanic, Black, Asian, or multiracial households to receive government incentives for homeowners to increase electrical efficiency of their homes. So, these are subsidies. This is maybe discounted smart thermostats, or access to incentives to switch to solar power, geothermal power, or whatever it be, or to upgrade your windows or your roof. All of these kinds of government incentives are being disproportionately granted to white families than to any other families. Those are all my thoughts on the June 19th discussion. For the June 20th discussion about remote work and our experience during the pandemic of coping with being a remote worker, I also have a kind of similar experience where I've basically done my entire PhD education remotely. My wife, who got her PhD back in August, was accepted to a very prestigious program in her field, which is rhetoric. She's a rhetorician at the Ohio State University. And so we moved to Columbus, Ohio, so she could pursue her PhD at this prestigious program. And that meant that I was basically working remotely the whole time. And so it was something of a mixed blessing for me whenever the pandemic hit, because everybody went online, and it it made me feel like I was not as much at a disadvantage as I felt like I had been up to that point. And so, yeah, I can completely relate to how isolating that can be, but I can also relate to the benefits that remote work can have. Anyway, that was my experience. Yeah, still grading, almost caught up. I just have a few more discussions to grade, and I'm working on your critical essay 3s right now. So yeah, I should be caught up, and I hope you all got your feedback from your critical essay 2s. If you have any questions about my feedback there, don't hesitate to email me. What I'm trying to do in that feedback is, one, give you some constructive criticism that you can build into your next writing project, to set up some basic ground rules and expectations for what constitutes good academic and specifically historical writing, and what sort of the precepts of historical analysis are. The other thing I'm trying to do is provide a justification for the grade that I gave you, so that when you see the grade I gave you, if you happen to be disappointed with that grade, you can say, you can go through my comments and say, okay, well, this is where what the rubric says, and this is where the points came off, so that you at least, even if you are dissatisfied with the grade, you at least have some explanation as to how I arrived at the grade that I arrived at. Yeah, like I said, let me know if you have any questions.